But before that, just a few housekeeping rules. First, please have your microphones on mute at all times, except of course when you speak. This will help reduce background noise so we can hear the person speaking more clearly. During the discussion, if you would like to speak, please raise your WebEx hand, and you can do this by scrolling to your name on the participants list, and you should see a icon with a hand there. I will pass this information on to the facilitator, and you can then unmute yourself when called on. At the same time, you can also use the chat function to share comments or questions. Based on the registrations, which was about 100 or so, we might have that many participants. So we recommend turning cameras off to reduce the bandwidth. Hopefully this will help make the connection not have as many lags. And only the scheduled speakers should have their cameras on. And lastly, to help us produce and publish a list of participants, please enter the following information on the WebEx chat: your full name, agency, organization, and country. Sometimes it's a little difficult to see the full name in the WebEx username. So if you could please type those into the WebEx chat, we would greatly appreciate it. And with that, I pass it on to Ms. Yoongi Min to open the workshop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Yoongi Min, and I'm the Chief of SDG Monitoring Section at the UN DESA Statistical Division. So on behalf of the UN Statistical Division, I would like to welcome you alongside with Ms. Irina Lupsevic, the Chief of Intergovernmental Policy Review Branch of UN DESA Office of Intergovernmental Support Division, to the workshop on preparing evidence-based voluntary national review for 2021 HLPF. So we all know that the voluntary national review prepared by country to be presented as a UN high-level political forum is one of the critical follow-up and review mechanism of the progress made towards the SDG. However, without timely and quality data, meaningful review of implementation of the 2030 agenda cannot be made. Timely, quality, open, and disaggregated data are critical for the successful implementation of the SDGs. They're essential for tracking performance of the SDGs, designing evidence-based policies, and allocating resources, holding governments, private sectors, and other stakeholders accountable, and helping to communicating SDGs.
Statistic of human.
So during the COVID-19 crisis, such data are particularly vital in understanding, managing, and mitigating the human, social, and economic effects of the pandemic. They can effectively guide decision-making at each step of the pandemic responses. So one important step for the effective usage of data in policymaking is to strengthen the dialogue between data producer, in this case is the national statistical system, and the data user, who are mainly represented by policymakers in this context. So improved collaboration between national statisticians and policymakers, try to understanding of each other's needs and capabilities is essential in the context of a complex, interdisciplinary, multi-stakeholder process such as the preparation of the VLRs. Therefore, one objective of the workshop is to bring together representatives from national statistical offices engaged in work on the SDG monitoring and the national VLR focal point engaged in policy making to discuss and share best practice on how data and statistics can support a data-driven and evidence-based VAR process. So we know the COVID crisis is causing serious disruption, which affect critical statistical operations across the entire global statistical and data system. So the workshop therefore also aims to highlight countries' responses to the COVID crisis in terms of data collection and the implementation of the SDGs, as well as discuss and share best practices and lessons learned, especially from those presenting the VAR a second or the third time on how data and statistics can support the VAR process. So the workshop is organized around the following themes. The first one is the session is on national SDG monitoring mechanisms and process. The second session is on assessing and reporting the impacts of COVID-19 in VNRs. The third session, which is the last session of today, is integrating new data sources and data innovation for official statistics and partnership with stakeholders. For tomorrow, there are two sessions. The first session of tomorrow is data disaggregation and leaving no one behind. And the last session will be communicating data in VRs and engaging data users. So the workshop aims to accomplish these objectives through improving knowledge by sharing experiences on addressing data gaps and use of data to inform evidence-based policy decisions on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and building partnerships among different data producers and data users to strengthen statistical capacity and improve data availability of vulnerable populations. So I would like to thank colleagues from many countries for participating and contributing to the workshop and share your experience and expertise on SDG monitoring and tools for the VRRs. So we look forward to the opportunity to work with you in the next 2 days to support data-driven and evidence-based VRRs. So I would like to encourage all of you to raise questions and have interactive discussion through the workshop. Thank you very much. So I would like to invite Arina to give an opening remark.
Thank you very much, Yongyi, and greetings, dear distinguished participants and dear colleagues. I would like to thank the Statistical Division of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs for organizing this important workshop and for the opportunity to say a few words at the opening. Let me start by quoting an English statistician, Arthur Bowley, who lived at the end of the 19th century and died in 1957. He pioneered the use of sampling techniques in social surveys, and he said the following: "A knowledge of statistics is like a knowledge of foreign languages or of algebra. It may prove of use at any time under any circumstances." The implementation of the 2030 Agenda has proven his words right. The agenda has stipulated that the national voluntary reviews need to be rigorous and based on evidence, informed by country-led evaluations and data, which is high quality, accessible, timely, reliable, and disaggregated. As we have been supporting VNR preparation since 2016, it is evident that reporting is increasingly more evidence and data-based. This is also the result of continuous work on indicators, data collection, and use of data. Nevertheless, more needs to be done. This is why this workshop is so timely, as you will have the opportunity to discuss with statistic experts from DESA all the important aspects of data related to VNRs. Without evaluation, monitoring, and data, it is difficult to show evidence-based progress. And this is so important, especially as COVID-19 has disrupted so many aspects of our lives, impacting also on data collection. The Secretary General Voluntary Reporting Guidelines on VNRs also emphasize the importance of showing progress on SDGs by using data and SDG statistical indicators to the extent possible. They also encourage countries to show how institutions systematically gather, share, analyze, and use data across sectors, and how this has helped with the implementation of the SDGs. Statistical annexes are also highly encouraged to be prepared using the Global Sustainable Development Goal indicators and adding priority indicators identified at the regional and national levels where appropriate. They may highlight whether statistics, including gender statistics, were collected from the National Statistical System and pinpoint major gaps in official statistics on indicators. As many of you are coming to present the VNR for the second and subsequent times, it is important to build on your previous VNR. The best possible way is to show through data how much progress has been made since the previous VNR or where more work needs to be done. Comparing the situation from the previous VNR to the current one is really most beneficial for our own national implementation of the 2030 Agenda. It is essential for identifying people who are left behind and for reducing poverty and inequalities in your societies. It is also essential for means of implementation and for aligning your budget to recover better from the pandemic. It is also important to link your VNR preparations, including on data, with other reporting processes that you have at the country level to, for example, human rights mechanisms or environmental agreements, especially Paris Agreement on climate change. Using data that has already been processed by other processes will save time and reduce reporting burden, but will also show how to maximize benefits of all these processes for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals. And lastly, I would like to encourage you to report on all SDGs if possible, or at least to focus on those SDGs that are your national priority, and not on the SDGs the 2021 High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development will review at the global level. VNRs are a reflection of your national implementation and not a global review on SDGs that is being done at the HLPF. I wish you fruitful discussions at this very interesting and useful workshop, and please do not hesitate to get in touch with us for the support you may need, as we are the Secretariat of the High-Level Political Forum and provide support to the Vienna process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irina. So we will start the first session of the workshop. So I will hand over to my colleague, Heather Page, who will facilitate this session. Heather, we cannot hear you. The microphone is muted.
How many thousand times have people heard that this year? Sorry. Hi, my name is Heather Page. I'm part of Youngie's team at UNSC. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone. So thank you all very much for joining, and we will go ahead and get started in session one, reviewing national SDG monitoring mechanisms and processes. Our first presentation will be by Ms. Youngie from UNSC, so I will pass the baton back to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. The first presentation I would like to give some overview on national SDG monitoring mechanism and processes. Paul, the slides.
Yes, I'll just load up the new one right now. Sorry. Hope you can assist her. Hi, do you see it now?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Next slide, please. So we all know we already emphasized the main purpose of this workshop, that VNRs should be underpinned by data and should be evidence based. So the report should cover what are the baseline of the study of the report, which goals areas are making progress, which areas are lagging behind, through the data, we need to show what policy are effective and what are not. In the country which population groups are left behind and need special attention. So this is the reason why we need to use data to support the policies and the decisions in the development plan and in presenting the VNRs. So reviewing the 2020 the VNRs, we noticed that majority of the country incorporated data into their reviews. In particular, over half of all VNRs in 2020 included a statistical annex. So data and the statistics are used in the VNRs to present progress achieved, challenge encountered in reaching the goals in target. So in particular, the data and the statistics used to present the baseline of the countries, and also for the second and the subsequent presenters, they also present the comparison from previous VNR reports. They also are helpful to present progress and evidence for policy making, and by using tables and graphs in the report. As I mentioned, many countries provide more detailed information in their statistical annex. And many also refer to useful tools such as online SDG data reporting platforms to have more detailed information on the SDG progress. In many of the countries, they also prepare a national SDG indicator report as a separate document to further support their VNRs. However, next slide, please. The country also run into a lot of challenges in preparing and the SDG monitorings and also the VNRs. Here I list a few main challenges identified by the countries. The first one, of course, is the data gaps and the lack of data for key indicators, which is the main issue that mentioned by many countries in preparing evidence-based VNRs. So in some key areas, such as a lot of environmental goals, there are no data available. So this result, the selection of statistical present in the VNR report does not always reflect the national SDG or policy priority stated elsewhere in the same VNR because of lack of data. And another challenging that mentioned by country is the need for timely data for swift policy intervention by governments and the development partners. In many cases, the data that collected by the national statistical system had some time delayed, or time lag, about 2 to 3 years, particularly for some social and environmental indicators, because the surveys is not carried out annually, and the reporting is probably is not timely. So which gave a big difficulty for making decision and intervention and policy intervention based on real-time data. And many countries also highlight the need to produce disaggregated data to address the leaving no one behind principles, and stressed they are facing difficulty in producing sufficient disaggregated data, particularly for the population group that are most vulnerable. Therefore, many countries highlight the need for increased financial and technical support to have sufficient data and statistics to produce a more evidence-based VNR and to monitor SDGs. Next slide, please. So what's the main elements for inclusive and country lead national review and reporting? And here's some a building block for national SDG reviews. In order to prepare national SDG report or VNR, we need to follow the core principles in the 2030 agenda, including the universality, leaving no one behind, integration and indivisibility, and human rights and national ownership, which are very essential for the SDG follow-up and review, and should be applied at each stage of the process. And it should be a country-led national review process. This can only deepen ownership by being broadly participatory, involve national and local authorities, civil societies, the private sector, and the academia. We know the integrated nature of the SDG implies that the national review process should advance understanding of linkage across the goals target. So we want to use the data to help to define and identify mechanisms that minimize the trade-off and maximize the synergy among the goals and the targets. And a human right-based approach to data will also bring together the relevant data stakeholders and the development communities of best practice to improve the quality, relevance, and the use of data and the statistics consistently with international human rights norm and principle. I want to emphasize the most important elements for this preparation is the dialogue between policymakers and the data producer. This is very critical, and so the policymakers will need to inform the data producer what type of data they need, and the data producer will respond to the need and inform the policy data what's data available which can be used in preparing the national SDG reporting. Next slide, please. Here are some of the items that need to be remembered when you prepare your national SDG indicators and the monitoring process. So a well-defined process is needed to prepare the SDG monitors and VNRs. So we know the national statistical system is essential to this process. And in particular, we want to emphasize the National Statistical Office play a critical coordination role and quality assurance roles. The national SDG indicator should be based on national priorities and the national development plan. And we can, in many countries, the global indicator framework can be used as a starting point to develop the national SDG indicator framework. So a mapping exercise is also critical to help ensure a more systematically inclusive and integrated approach to the implementation of the national indicators. In most cases, we suggest the national SDG indicator should be prepared by the National Statistical Office with collaboration with different ministries and partners. And also metadata is a very important information, and because we want to ensure the methodology used are consistent and the data sources from the same country and apply the same methodology. So to the largest extent possible, we also want to, the measure of the indicator should reflect international statistical practice and the standards. So eventually the mapping exercise also help in developing a clear set of strategies and national action plan for the development statistics. Next slide, please. Here I gave a few good examples on the country examples that shared with us in another workshop on data and statistics. The first example is from Czech Republic. In here, you see that the prime minister's leading the government council for sustainable development and involve many stakeholders, and they establish many committees for under this government councils. And one particular committee is for SDG indicators, which facilitate better data coordination, availability mapping, and development indicators, leading by the Czech Statistical Office and in collaborations with other data providers from the whole state statistical system or out of the state statistical system. So the next example, next slide, please, is from Malaysia. And in Malaysia, similarly, a national SDG council is established, establish direction for SDG implementation, which chaired by the Prime Minister. And this steering committee established under 5 different working committee clusters who oversee the different goals and targets. And the Department of Statistics Malaysia is a focal point for data on SDG. They established a SDG task team to identify and establish a strategic technical framework between the Department of Statistics and other ministry and agency involved in the development SDG indicator, and review the development SDG indicator for the purpose of research, planning, and policy formulation by the government. So next slide, please. So we mentioned the mapping exercises. So in order to, after developing the national SDG indicators, a mapping exercise is very critical to check in what's available. So on data availability, where the data from, the data sources, what's methodology being used and to collect the data, how frequent the data are collected, and the level of disaggregation. So this is a very multi-stakeholder process and a participatory process, normally led by the National Statistics Office. Next slide, please. So there's a few elements that shaping and the SDG monitor, and we need a legal framework for data process and the data sharing, and normally the Statistical Law or Information Act. And a national SDG monitoring coordination body should be established, which discuss the indicator, data sharing and the responsibility, and what's the data flow mechanism, and also develop strategies and plan for statistical capacity building. And there's an agency who's leading the process, normally the National Statistics Office as a coordination agency, and to receive the data from the member of the national statistical system by sharing the data at aggregate or macro level and metadata, and provide feedback for quality control. They compile and disseminate data and metadata for SDG indicator and control data quality, and also in many cases establish a SDG data platform. Next slide, please. And what approach elements should include for data sharing? And formal level, we know there's a legal basis, legal framework, and formal agreements, a memorandum of understanding, and there's a coordination committee. This does not always lead to the action plan. So we need at practice level, and we need to establish focal points and in the responding agencies for providing data and the responsible checking the data. And there's a practical template for exchange the data on data, which indicator, what disaggregation level, the period, the frequency of the data, the format and means of transition of the data, and the metadata. And this need to be structured and very regulated in terms of data. And next slide, please. I probably will not go to detail, and I think quality assurance and assessment is very critical, and a formal process should be established to ensure quality is assessed at each stage. And there's also a feedback mechanism should be established to provide feedback on the quality of the data provided. So next slide, please. here's we will encourage develop a regular data cycle or data roadmap for annual SDG monitor. This is just an example that how to develop the data roadmap for 2021 VNRs. Normally in the end of previous year, you establish a SDG monitoring coordination body and agree with all the agencies and on how to provide the data, the timeline, the format, the data provision, and checking the data availability. And by beginning of the year, you collect and assess the data from the statistical system and identify the gaps. And around March, and you can address the data gaps and to explore if there's any alternate data source to fill the data gaps. And in May, around there, you analyze the data collected and prepare the report, present the progress, the challenging in achieving the SDGs. And then you prepare the final report and present the VNR in July and at HLPF. But this is can be a continuous cycle and for annual SDG reporting. So last slide, please. So I will not go into details. The one issue we probably will talk about later and throughout the workshop is also how to address data gaps and strengthening national statistical capacity for evidence-based VNRs. I just want to mention there's a Cape Town Global Action Plan for sustainable development data and list 6 key areas on how to strengthen the statistical capacity and with the detailed actions. And there's also a Dubai Declaration on developing an innovative funding mechanism. And so I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Young-Yi. So this session is focusing on the best practices and lessons learned from national monitoring mechanisms or the institutional arrangements for the SDGs, including data sharing and data flow arrangements for monitoring the SDGs for an inclusive national SDG review process. And so we would like to hear from some countries on their experiences and best practices to share with the workshop participants. Our first presenter will be Ms. Nada Yacob from the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development of Egypt. So I will pass the floor to her. Thank you very much.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for UNDESA for allowing us the opportunity to share this information with you. My name is Nada Yacob. I work at the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development and the Sustainable Development Unit. And hopefully in the coming 10 minutes, I will be introducing you to the national SDG monitoring mechanisms in Egypt. Next slide, please. So first of all, for institutional arrangements, a couple of years ago, there was an establishment of sustainable development units and task forces in the different government entities and ministries. And so these sustainable development units, they received training and technical support from the Central Sustainable Development Unit at the Ministry of Planning. And the aim was to facilitate all communications and data sharing and information sharing with regards to planning for sustainable development, whether between the ministries and between the entities. And this came very helpful when the country started working on updating its Egypt Vision 2030, which is the National Sustainable Development Strategy. And so these units are an important part in the data sharing mechanism and also in information sharing mechanisms when it comes to information on sustainable development in the country. There was also in 2017 an establishment of the National Committee for Monitoring the Implementation of the SDGs. It was a ministerial, actually, committee, and it was issued due to a prime ministerial decree. And it is composed of ministers and representatives from 17 ministries and state entities. Equally, also, this committee has a major role of ensuring that there is a collaborative action towards achieving the SDGs, and also in facilitating as well the information sharing, but also a monitoring role of where the country is going when it comes to the SDGs, and how are we achieving the SDGs, and so on. Next slide, please. As for the SDG indicators data, so a very important step was the creation of a national report for the SDGs data. So first of all, CAPMES is the central agency for public mobilization and statistics. So it's basically the National Statistical Office. And CAPMES in 2018, they created the first statistical report, which gathers all data on the available indicators, and this is on an annual basis. So they released one in 2018, one in 2019. They're working on the one of 2020, but unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 situation, the report is delayed. This report is very handy when because it's inclusive of data from the different ministries. It's not just from CAPMES, but it's also, so for example, in the 2019 report, they gathered data from 23 different ministries and entities, and also from data from surveys that CAPMES itself does. And this kind of ensures that there's a reviewing or mechanism. 2018, the report, 47.5% of SDG indicators had data available. Have the next slide. Also, within the same, there's an observatory dashboard that was created from in cooperation with UNICEF Egypt country office, as well as with financial support from the UNRCO in Egypt. And this dashboard, it also gathers the data for the SDG indicators on this platform. However, it is also a really good initiative because it provides a more interactive platform for anyone who wants to access data on SDGs in Egypt. It is in English. The report of CAPMES is in Arabic, so it also has this feature of having it in English. And it's great because it's not just available for like government entities or so, but it's also made data available for other stakeholders who would like to see where the country stands when it comes to the SDGs, and perhaps what areas they could help in to achieve the SDGs, and so on. There's also a mobile application available and under the same name, and so it's really just very easy to access. It's worth mentioning that in a report, the report was about national reporting platforms in the Arab region. And so Egypt ranked first among 9 countries in the Arab region because of implementing 50% of the national reporting platforms criteria. Criteria like data visualization, for example, downloading formats, multilingual access, and so on. Can I have the next slide? Another very important initiative that was done is SDG localization reports. So currently, the Ministry of Planning is working on these localization reports, which basically monitor the performance of the governorate in the SDGs, and also how far each governorate is when it comes to the targets that were set for each governorate in the SDG indicators. It also allows for having, better disaggregation of data, because data disaggregation has always been a challenge, and I believe not just for Egypt. I mean, a lot of countries report that this is a problem that they're facing, and so these reports kind of are a step in this problem, and they also provide recommendations for the governorates on how to improve or what areas they need to focus on, and also how to take into consideration the comparative advantage of each governorate. And these reports are actually a third phase of a project that was ongoing with UNFPA and also with Basira, which is the Egyptian Center for Public Opinion Research. And this was the third phase. I can talk about it more maybe in the discussion points later. Can I have the next slide? Also, when it comes to a national strategy, so CAPMAS is currently working on a national strategy for development of statistics, which is a huge step because it's going to be the first of its kind in Egypt, as there is no such strategy at the moment that gathers a statistical plan for the whole country. So this is what they're working on. They have support from the World Bank and from the African Development Bank. And basically, each entity and each ministry is receiving support, technical guidance, and so on from experts on and from CAPMAS on how to build their own statistical plan with goals and targets, and also projects that they aim to implement in order to achieve their statistical goals. Their goals when it comes to statistics in the entity. And at the end, these plans will be combined into one strategy for a national strategy. And so this will definitely ensure that we have improved data sharing and availability, as it's always a challenge. And it's not specifically for the SDGs, however, it will definitely help in improving availability of data for SDG indicators. Can I have the next slide, please? So other monitoring mechanisms, we have two initiatives that were done by the Ministry of Planning. So there are two electronic platforms. The first one is for monitoring and evaluation, and it's where the entities or ministries insert the projects that are funded from public investment. And so it's a criteria, or it's a requirement that the entities map the projects or these projects that they insert to the SDGs. So it helps to see, what projects aim to achieve which SDGs, what are focused on more than others, and so on. Also, there's another platform that maps the indicators of the government program, which is a 4-year program, also to the SDGs. And lastly, the last point, there is a policy tracker that the ministry developed with the start of the COVID-19 crisis. It's mainly focusing on COVID-19 related policies or measures, and it maps all the policies to the SDGs. And so this is a great initiative as well to show that how the country is reacting or acting to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the SDGs and how they're dealing with it. And as of 10th of Jan, this Jan, so there were 486 policies or measures starting from the COVID-19 situation when it started in Egypt. Can I have the next slide, please? So I see that my 10 minutes are done, so I'll go over quickly that there's also, of course, stakeholders are always engaged in improving and facilitating that we have SDG indicators data. So, for example, CAPMAS has partnerships with UN agencies and also with other agencies or other government ministries as well, to always improve the SDG indicators. And in the VNR preparation process, definitely stakeholders participate when it comes to providing information on initiatives and data, but also initiatives that they're undertaking to achieve certain SDGs. And I think I can talk about this more again in the discussion. Thank you very much, and thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I think we can all benefit from hearing about the experience of Egypt in particular on the national SDG reports and the policy and investment mapping. So thank you. And we do look forward to additional information during the discussion. I'm going to move over to our next presenter, who is from Japan. So Ms. Aya Yoshida from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will provide the next presentation during this session. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I just want to share my presentation here first. Right. Right. So at the outset, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to you and DESA for inviting me to introduce Japan's efforts for achieving the SDGs. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the vulnerability of the international community. So the coronavirus is posing a threat to the lives, livelihoods, and dignity of the people across the globe. And this pandemic is indeed a human security crisis. In order to overcome this crisis, we believe leaving no one behind must be a guiding principle for us. So considering the impact of the COVID-19 crisis, we need to accurately review and monitor the progress of the SDGs. So today's themes of the discussion are very timely, and we are looking forward to discussing with colleagues so that we can learn good practices and examples to reflect for our voluntary national review process. So today, I first would like to oversee some of the key features of Japan's institutional arrangements to achieve SDGs. So just some of the slides here. So let me begin by explaining international institutional arrangements of Japan and how we conduct inclusive national review process for promoting SDGs. So just to go through this slide, after the adoption of the 2030 agenda, Japan first built a foundation for the implementation of SDGs by establishing the SDG promotion headquarters in May 2016, which was headed by the Prime Minister and composed of all cabinet ministers. And since public-private partnership is essential for the implementation of the SDGs, this promotion headquarters decided to launch roundtable meeting on the promotion of SDGs, which was composed of experts from a wide range of fields, including private sector, civil society, academia, and international organizations. So I think this is one of our efforts to include involve multi-stakeholder in this process. So based on the intensive discussion in the roundtable meeting and comments from the public, the promotion headquarters formulated the SDG implementation guiding principles in December 2016, which sets out Japan's medium to long-term strategy toward achievement of the SDG. So I would say this is a kind of legal framework for Japan's efforts to implement the SDGs. So as the SDG covers cross-cutting issues, which were covered by several government institutions, therefore it is quite difficult for a single ministry like us, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to handle all the issues related to the SDGs. Therefore, the Secretariat of Headquarters was established in the Cabinet Office under the Prime Minister, and the Cabinet and this Secretariat sends instruction to relevant institutions to gather information if needed. So I think this type of institutional arrangements include all the ministries and governmental institutions are functioning well for Japan to promote SDGs. So just to go through some of the actions actually which we are taking under the headquarters. So if you see the slide here, since 2017, the promotion headquarters annually formulated SDG action plan, which comprises specific government key initiatives and their budget to visualize Japan's government's contribution toward achieving the SDGs. So just to touch upon some of the features of the impact of COVID-19. So this is the Action Plan 2021, which was adopted last December. So, as for this action plan, compared with the previous year, the total amount of initiatives in this action plan jumped from about 1.7 trillion yen, which is equal to $60 billion, to about 6.5 trillion yen, which is equal to 62 billion US dollars. So this really highlights the significant increase of the number of the policies to counter to the negative impact of the COVID-19. And I think also this also reflects the fact that we have been implementing this action plan since 2017. And this means more and more ministries are integrating SGD policies into their own policies. And that's why we see significant increase of the SGD policies in Japan. So just to go through some of the, legal frameworks or institutional arrangement, how we implement SGDs, I just want to go back to implementation guiding principles. So this is the highlight of the implementation guiding principles. And Japan basically sets out 8 priority areas to show that Japan should focus on, among the SGD's 17 goals and 169 targets. You can see number 3 here, priorities. We formulated this priority around the 5 P's as was advocated by the United Nations, which is people, prosperity, planet, peace, and partnership. And in the SGD action plan, what we do is that the specific initiatives in the SGD action plan, both in terms of domestic implementation and international implementation, are basically characterized by these 8 principles, the 8 priority areas. And by doing so, I think we try to digest the key areas of the 17 goals so that people in Japan easy to understand how their policies are related to these areas of priorities of the policies. And to let the people know that they are more easy to take actions under the SGDs. We are taking some of the actions. And one of the initiatives is the Japan SGDs Award. And this was established in June 2017 in order to encourage companies and organizations and all the others, to work toward achieving SGDs and promote all Japan initiatives. Each year, the most outstanding proposal is selected for an award by the Prime Minister himself. And this gives incentive for local stakeholders to take actions in the SGDs. And this is the picture that Prime Minister Suga himself gave award to the winners of the SGD award. The other initiative is so-called SGD Future City, which is basically to include more local governments and cities to implement SGDs. So each year, the national government was designated about 30 municipalities as SGD Future Cities based on their efforts to integrate SGDs into their policies. Among these, about 10 outstanding municipalities were chosen each year, and the national government has provided them with subsidies to accelerate actions on the SGDs. So with these initiatives, the number of the stakeholders which take actions of SGDs is gradually growing. And a recently conducted survey by the Japanese private company showed that percentage of the Japanese people who know about SGDs jumped from 14.8% in April 2018 to 29.1% in April 2020. So we believe that COVID-19 crisis raised awareness on the SGD, and the number will be much higher in this year. And just let me focus on some of the issues related with the monitoring and the data and the statistics, which is a question you raised in the form point 2. So I think we in order to appropriately monitor the progress of the SGD-related measures and steadily promote them, the promotion headquarters is expected to regularly check and progress of the initiative based on the implementation guiding principles and SGD action plan. And this is decided in follow-up and review in the implementation guideline. If you see that this promotion headquarters shall regularly check the progress of the initiatives and make revision as needed. So this is a legal framework to ensure the monitoring process of the SGD. And to accurately gauge the achievement status of the SGDs, data-based SGD indicators should be utilized, and progress results shall be disclosed internationally and domestically as appropriate. In this regard, our statistics agent, the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, which oversees statistics in Japan, gather information on STD global indicators, together with other ministries and national institutions. And the methods of preparing the data is discussed under the STD promotion headquarters, this headquarter, and the data is published on the Secretariat website. So we've been taking these actions, and we see some of the improvements and progress in terms of data and statistics. And first and foremost, the number of the indicators. Among 247 STD global indicators, 127 indicators, which is 51.4% of the total, have been published as of 24th December 2020. And 11 more indicators are scheduled to be published in the coming months, which will bring us to the total of 55.9%. So I think the number of the coverage, actually the percentage of coverage, is actually gradually increasing. The second point is, I would say, this is the multi-stakeholder engagement, and probably, to create the venue to discuss how the indicators on monitoring should be. So because some of the global indicators are such as extreme poverty, malnutrition, or primary healthcare are not very informative when describing the situation in Japan. So we are now discussing that progress evaluation system shall be enhanced while using proxy data or paying due attention to evaluation by domestic and international research institutions. And also last year, we established a working group called Monitoring the Progress of the STDs under the STD Promotion Roundtable. So which means this kind of, this stakeholders discussion on the monitoring on progress are actually discussing how the monitoring process should be and how the indicators should be used and what type of index should be used if there is no available data exists in the domestic system. So I think we are I would say this is so-called a dialogue between policymakers and data producers, as Yumi pointed out. Such interaction and dialogue between the statistics or a ministry and the users or policymakers are quite very effective and quite insightful. So, but again, I think we are still on the process of improving this monitoring and monitoring the progress of the STDs, and we are very much looking forward to learn from the good examples of the other countries. So therefore, we would be very delighted if we could hear in today's discussions good practices of other countries so that we can reflect them on our process to promote STDs and include them in our voluntary national review. With that, I would end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the prompt is appropriate and helpful for the other participants in the workshop to move into our next session, which is the discussion questions and discussion about this session. But I wanted to give an opportunity before we start going into those discussions, if anyone has any immediate questions for the three speakers that we've just heard from. So if anyone has any questions that they would like to either put in the chat or raise their virtual hand, we just want to give an opportunity to do that as well. And Paul, I'm not sure if I'm able to see hands, if you'll just let me know.
Right now, I don't see any. But...
No burning questions at the moment? It's still early, I guess. Okay, well, hopefully, as we get the discussion moving, participants will have an opportunity to also ask any questions as well to the participant, to the speakers and to the other participants in the workshop. So for this we sent out discussion questions in advance of the workshop potentially a little close to the start. But we wanted to really try to engage with all of the countries because sharing their best practices and in particular their lessons learned is very useful, obviously, for other countries developing their VNR. So one of our first questions is related to this is what efforts are being made to set up a national monitoring coordination mechanism to support the collection of data for an evidence-based VNR. And my colleague Paul is actually going to put this question as a poll into the WebEx chat. And we're trying to understand, what ministries are involved and what role does the National Statistics Office play in the institutional mechanism. So Paul, okay, there you go. So, does your country have a national monitoring coordination mechanism established to support the collection of data for an evidence-based VNR? And if so, does the National Statistical Office lead this coordination mechanism? And so we want to give just a couple minutes for you to answer these questions in the poll. It's here in the chat. I hope everyone can see it. And we'll give just a couple minutes for everyone to provide their answers. As we heard in the presentations about the institutional arrangements and in particular the exchange between the national statistical offices and also the other data providers throughout the kind of data ecosystem in the country, as well as the monitoring coordination mechanism. Paul, we're not able to see the poll as it is fed into the system.
Right now, no, but I think only when it ends you'll see the results. But right now, out of the 74 participants, 26 have answered, and
great.
About
okay, we'll just give it a little bit more time to try to get a few more answers.
Oh man, I have the timer at 20 more seconds, so hopefully. But I mean,
Okay.
to get an idea. So. And I'll post the results. I'll share the result.
Okay, great. Okay, so we have about.
Do you see the results?
I can't see them in the chat, but is there an actual poll that we will, like a graph that we will see?
Oh, it's not letting me do it. But
okay, so I can't actually. Okay, so essentially, about 16% or 12 countries have a national coordination mechanism, and the NSO is leading this process. And then 21% or about 16 countries note that you do have a national coordination mechanism, but another institute is leading the monitoring. And then we have 2 countries that say that there is no national coordination mechanism. Okay, so this is just a kind of, it seems that countries have about, similar, yes, the NSO leads and yes, they have a national coordination mechanism or potentially another institute leads it. So what we wanted to do next part of these discussion questions was also looking at the inclusion of data and statistics in the VNR and also the preparation of the statistical annex. I don't know if any countries want to chime in about their experience with including the statistical annex, or also the benefits of having a statistical annex to their VNR. Just give an opportunity for someone to come in or raise your hand. But in addition, we wanted to open up the floor to talking also about the challenges faced with the data collection and the management for the preparation of the VNR. We've had some examples here of lessons learned and best practices, but could some countries kind of talk about the challenges that they've encountered either in past VNR preparation or in the current 2021 preparation?
Hi, Heather. I don't know if you see, but there's a hand up from Sweden. Sarah?
Please, Sarah, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me now? I'm doing this from my phone because my computer is there's a problem with it, so I'm not completely used to where the button is, but I think you can hear me now.
We can. Thank you.
Yeah, good. So this is our second VNR this summer, and I was one of the countries that put that we have a coordination mechanism that is led by the NSO, and I did that because we do have a coordination mechanism. It's not set up for the VNR specifically, but for the sort of the indicator-based follow-up. So we present from I am from Statistics Sweden, and we do an annual review. So this year's VNR will be based to a large extent on the last two annual reports that we did, and this year's annual review will actually be the statistical annex. So we're planning to do the annual report in the form of an annex. So it's kind of sort of incorporated in the VNR process will be sort of incorporated in the normal follow-up process. But I think there might be a difference between different countries, whether you have a process set up that is kind of always running, or whether you set up a specific process for the VNR specifically. But I just wanted to share how we are planning to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that's actually a great example of kind of the progress or the progression of the statistical annex and how it can be helpful for the VNR. So thank you very much for sharing that. Are there any additional comments that people or in any other countries would like to share on the challenges that they are facing with the data collection and management? We'll actually very shortly put up a word cloud so that you can provide input that way as well. But I just wanted to allow an opportunity, if you had any interventions, to feel free to go ahead now as well.
Hi, Heather. I see a hand up from Spain. Mercedes?
Please, Mercedes. Thank you.
Hello. Can you hear me well?
Yes, thank you.
We can,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay, I'll go. I'm speaking on behalf of Spanish Secretary of State for 2030 Agenda in the Ministry of Social Rights and to 2030 Agenda. I'd like to share our last activity on coordination regarding indicators, just in case it would be a good practice to share with all of you. We're pretty sure that if we count with a good monitoring system, that would help us to set up evidence-based policies and identify where the real and current challenges are and who can be left behind. With a clear purpose to have available, timely and appropriate data, the Cabinet of Secretary of State has coordinated and organized a workshop last 14 December. In the workshop, Sorry, my voice is not very well this morning. The workshop tried to drive the process to define indicators and also to get the best consensus among all the stakeholders. This set of indicators will take part of our 2030 Sustainable Development Strategy, still in process, essential for the implementation and monitoring 2030 agenda. This effort has been made with the priceless role of our National Statistics Institution, the INE in Spanish abbreviations, and it has counted with the participation of the majority of ministries of the coalition government and also with social actors. The workshop had two segments. First one was focused on institutional analysis and proposals about indicators, just with the perspective of the institutions. And the second one had two interventions from NGOs with two different segments, not two different interventions. One was focused on social issues. Specifically, one was about ecological footprint indicator and social issues and environmental issues. We expected to get three things: a whole review of 2030 agenda indicators, a development of them if necessary, and strengthening of this set of indicators. To end my intervention, I like to add that all this revision and coordination must be done considering all the best practices at European and international level, as a proof that peer learning is a valuable tool, and of course must take into account the methodological development degree of indicators, the level of disaggregation, and the availability and regularity of data. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. And I think it's really appreciate also understanding also how stakeholders are involved as well. I would like to give the floor next to Egypt, to Nada.
Very much. I want to add about the challenges, because you were talking about the challenge that we faced. So I want to mention some of them and how we dealt with it. So first of all, I talked about how the National Statistics Office have surveys that they do, in addition, of course, to the data from the ministries, but they also have surveys that they do in order to also collect data for the SDG indicators. And some of these surveys are not done regularly or have stopped now for a few years, because there's a lot of support required to conduct these surveys, for example. Also, a lot of ministries, they need technical supports for measuring some of the indicators, or they need support to actually collect the data. And also, in some cases, there's duplication of indicators in more than one entity, or duplication in the data. So this also is one of the challenges. And lastly, of course, disaggregated data on the level of the local governorates. So I'll mention a few things that we did to help with that. So first of all, definitely stakeholders were helping with that. So for example, last year, right before the Corona situation started, we actually conducted a workshop with the different ministries, as well as with CAPMES, of course, with us, and also with different organizations such as UN organizations and other international organizations. And the aim of this workshop was basically for either ministries to display what data is missing from them, or what support they are needing, and in which SDGs that they need this kind of support. And also for the international organizations to say, like, in what way can they support, or which SDGs can they help with measuring the indicators, or gathering the data, or so on. And so this was very beneficial, because it allowed for this dialogue and communication to happen between the different entities, and and it resulted in a good, it has a good result. But of course, the cooperations were because of the COVID-19 situation, not all the activities that were supposed to happen took place. Also, the national statistics strategy that I was talking about is one of the ways in which we are aiming, hopefully, to avoid the duplication and to make it easier to just know which data is available in which entity and so on. And that's it. I don't want to. Oh, one last thing, I'm sorry, is I want to just mention an example that the CAPMIS did. They worked with 2 UN organizations. So they worked, for example, with FAO to work on availing indicators. And as a result of this, they managed to measure 7 indicators, 6 from SDG 2 and 1 from SDG 14. And also they had a cooperation with UN Water, and as a result, they were able to measure 6 indicators from SDG 6. So definitely stakeholder engagement was a great way to support in this data availability for the SDG indicators. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that information, and in particular, the way that the engagement among different stakeholders has helped to identify gaps and where support is needed. I think this is a very valuable example for participants. So there is a question in the chat related to during conducting surveys during the pandemic. If it's okay, I would like to park that question so that we can put it into include it during session 2 when we discuss COVID-19. I hope that's okay. Before we end this session, I just wanted to pull up the word cloud on this question to kind of get everyone's input about the main challenges faced with data collection and management for the preparation of the VNR. So if you'll notice in the chat, we have a link to the Slido question. And so it's using a few words. What are the main challenges faced with data collection and management for the preparation of the VNR? This is just a way to have an opportunity for all participants to be able to provide input without having to necessarily speak or put a question in the chat. So we just wanted to give you an opportunity here to also participate in this question. So we'll give this a couple minutes. Again, the link is in the chat. So you just click on the link in the chat and then we'll be able to see it updating here.
Yes, and there's also another option that I just discovered, that to do the poll, you can go to slido.com like you see on the screen, and you can enter that event number, and it should take you to this question as well.
I imagine the QR could also be used.
That too, yeah. If you want to go fancy, yes.
Yeah. We have 3 participants who have provided input. Happy to receive a few more if they would like. Great, thank you. So this information is also a lot of what we were receiving during the registration. One of the questions was also on the main challenges faced with regard to data collection and management for the preparation of the VNR. And a lot of it is related to data disaggregation, coordination, frequency of data collection, obviously the pandemic, and data availability and data assurance. And the change from having face-to-face surveys and moving to other methods. Excellent. Great. Really appreciate it. Feel free to continue to populate the word cloud. I also wanted to mention that we are having some questions for the speakers in the chat to Japan, asking if you conducted a labor force survey during COVID-19 and how. So we'll also move some of these questions to the next session, which is on COVID-19. But for the speakers, feel free to answer any of the questions directly in the chat as well. So we want to also provide that opportunity for engagement. Okay. All right. So again, main data challenges are related also to data disaggregation, availability, coordination, and frequency of data collection. So we hope to also address these issues in the coming sessions as well. I'm going to stop here for this session. Thank you very much to all of our speakers and also for your engagement during the discussion. We really appreciate it. And we have a short break. We're just about 10 minutes behind, but I don't think that's a problem. We will still take just a 5-minute break. So if everyone could please come back about 9:27 is what I have, or in about 5 minutes, and we'll get started on the next session, which is assessing and including the impacts of COVID-19 in the VNRs. Thank you very much, and we'll see you very shortly.
So, dear colleague, welcome back. And hopefully, you had a quick short break. So I will take over the moderation of this session 2 on assessing and including the impact of COVID-19 in VR. So this session will focus on how countries have carried out data collection process and monitoring the SDG during this COVID pandemic, and how to assess the impact of COVID having on SDG progress. And the session will highlight ways to report this impact in the VNRs. So first, I would like to invite my colleague Heather Page to give a presentation on how to report and assessing the COVID-19 pandemic in SDG monitoring and reporting. Heather, over to you.
Thank you, Youngie. Okay, so next slide, please. Thank you. At the SDG Summit in 2019, member states recognized that global efforts to date had been insufficient to deliver on the promise of the 2030 Agenda. And even before the COVID-19 pandemic, progress remained uneven and the global community was not on track to meet the goals by 2030. Now, due to COVID-19, as many have already noted, the unprecedented health, economic, and social crises are threatening lives and livelihoods and making the achievement of the goals even more challenging. The pandemic has abruptly disrupted implementation toward many of the SDGs, and in some cases is turning back decades of progress. As Youngie had mentioned in her earlier presentation, during the COVID-19 crisis, timely, quality, and open, as well as disaggregated data are vital for understanding, managing, and mitigating these impacts of the pandemic. And the Secretary General noted that leadership and support are needed to ensure the statistical organizations have the tools and resources they need to facilitate timely and smart decision making, which can effectively guide this decision making at each step of the pandemic response, looking not only at the short-term interventions, but also the long-term accelerated actions, and as well as the strategies that will be needed to put countries back on track. And far from undermining the case for the SDGs, the root causes and uneven impacts of COVID-19 demonstrate precisely why we need the 2030 Agenda and the strong need for data and evidence to support all aspects. Next slide, please. So part of the revised voluntary common reporting guidelines for the VNRs includes guidelines on new and emerging challenges, recommending to develop a section in the report to describe how the country is recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, which should or could also include plans for building back better, ensuring that recovery measures advance the SDGs while strengthening resilience in these social, economic, and environmental dimensions. It can also include description of other challenges because countries have obviously also had to deal with many other issues along with COVID-19, including hurricanes, famine, migration, as well as the effects of climate change. And then beyond assessing just those negative effects, the section should also be analytical and forward-looking in terms of discussing policies and measures for how to recover better, addressing any underlying structural frictions, defining future actions needed if faced with another pandemic or a similar issue or calamity, as well as focusing on leaving no one behind. Next slide, please. And as we all know, the COVID-19 has impacted almost all the SDGs. This is an illustration from UNDESA and a publication by the Secretary General early in the pandemic from March, denoting the impact of COVID-19 on almost all the SDGs, as well as the knock-on effects from one goal to another. This is just one example of how one could illustrate the impact of COVID-19 on the SDGs in the report. In this particular illustration notes the loss of income leading to vulnerabilities and poverty, the higher risk of COVID-19 exposure in slums due to population density and poor sanitation, as well as devastating effects on health outcomes. Next slide, please. An additional example, also from UNDESA, from a policy brief, looks at the severity of the impact, which is influenced by the pre-pandemic progress or stagnation. And in this illustration, and I've provided the links for each of these so that you can see them better, obviously, because this is a little bit small. But this illustration looks at specific goals, in particular goals 3, 6, 9, 11, and 15, and then how that will look for the SDGs by 2030, and also ways to mitigate those impacts. So it kind of takes you from each level, the severity of the impact, how that will look, and also how to mitigate those impacts. So this is just another example of how that could potentially be included in a VNR report. Next slide, please. So apart from the voluntary guidelines, a recommendation for how to report COVID-19 impacts in the 2021 VNR starts with basing this on the national indicator framework. And the reporting should focus on the progress made or the status in the first 5 years before COVID. This example here includes Goal 1 and the fact that the world was off track to end poverty by 2030, and also under 5 mortality had fallen by almost 50% since 2000. And then comparing that to the COVID-19 impacts on progress. So here we have the inclusion of COVID-19 implications, such as for Goal 3, a spike in malaria deaths, 400 million job losses, and 88 to 115 million people being pushed back into poverty. These are just some examples, and I'll provide a few more in the next couple of slides. So the report can highlight goals highly impacted by the pandemic, focusing on society, goals 1 through 5, economy, goals 8 and 9, and the environment, goals 12 and 13. These are obviously just examples. Since this is based in the national indicator framework and national priorities, obviously that those indicators and goals would be determined by that. And then also the inclusion, as I mentioned earlier, but the response and recovery efforts based on sound data and science and guided by the SDGs. Next slide, please. Some examples of further impacts illustrated, and this is from our SDG report 2020, noted that before COVID-19, food insecurity was already on the rise. And then the effects of the pandemic is that it's an additional threat to food systems where you already had climate shocks, conflicts, locust crises, et cetera. And then another example is that progress toward inclusive and equitable quality education was actually too slow, and over 200 million children would still be out of school in 2030. And in COVID-19 impacts, you have remote learning, which is actually remains out of reach for at least 500 million students. Next slide, please. And just one more example of the impacts of COVID-19 and how to include it is for goals 8 and 9, progress, the global economic growth was actually slowing down. And now the world faces one of the worst economic recessions with a GDP per capita expected to decline. And then also manufacturing growth was declining, and now we have an aviation industry suffering its deepest decline in history. So this is just kind of looking at progress or stagnation of the indicators or the goals in the past 5 years, and then comparing where the COVID impact, where the data is available, of course. Next slide, please. So while the virus has impacted everyone, it is the poorest and most vulnerable who are affected disproportionately by the pandemic. And the report should include the impacts on those who are most vulnerable. And here we have some examples again from the 2020 report, looking at how during the pandemic, 1.6 billion workers in the informal economy risked losing their livelihood. And then there was a surge in reports of domestic violence. From the 2020 VNRs, it was noted that in many countries, COVID-19 had disproportionately impacted persons with disabilities. And some examples, Moldova and Trinidad and Tobago, recognized that students with disabilities without access to technology were at the most at risk of falling behind. And then Bulgaria also mentioned in their VNR, their 2020 VNR, the allocation of funding to target older people and people with disabilities to ensure the continuation of social services during their state of emergency. Next slide, please. So the inclusion of COVID-19 impacts in 2020 VNRs, this is kind of just some examples from the last round, where nearly all countries reported in some way on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, in particular the disruption that it caused for the preparation of their reporting of their 2020 report, in particular their preparatory processes, their consultations and workshops, as well as, and most importantly, the final review and the validation. Additional impacts that countries included was that information and data collection was also affected. And so you had a shift to phone interviews in order to collect data. And I have another slide on that in just a second. And then the pandemic also required flexibility and highlighted the importance of technology and digital solutions. Some positive outcomes, though, were the broadened stakeholder engagement, whereas some negative impacts were limited stakeholder engagement or statistical activities, which is potentially affecting the evidence base for some of the VNRs. Next slide, please. Here I just include an example of one of the mobile surveys that was in South Africa, and this kind of links to the next session on additional data innovations and data sources, in particular in COVID, but also just in general. Next slide, please. So apart from the impacts of COVID-19 on just the processes, the 2020 VNR reports also included the impacts on SDG progress, the impacts of COVID-19 on SDG progress, detailing that the pandemic has set back the SDG progress and is undermining ongoing implementation efforts, adding new challenges, impacting small and medium enterprises, the social dimensions, and in particular the relevance of vulnerable groups and leaving no one behind, and the impact of poverty and the effect on children. They did also note in some of the countries about the highlighted opportunities for digital transformation, including an e-governance expansion, virtual platforms, upgrading information technology, improving national preparedness, the scale up of localization efforts, and then again, also a call for global solidarity. And here, sorry, next slide, please. I include just two examples from the actual 2020 VNRs, where Costa Rica was looking at the impact, primary and secondary impacts, and noting the actions to try to contain the pandemic in the country, and then still estimating significant consequences on all dimensions of sustainable development, and with indicators potentially moving backward. At the time, though, the estimation for that data was still uncertain. And Uzbekistan also here in their VNR noted the impact of COVID-19 on progress in the SDGs, talking about the impact of employment as well as other areas throughout the country. Next slide, please. And it's important to note, as the VNRs have progressed, how countries are strengthening national statistical capacity for evidence-based VNRs, where the national statistical system is central to the national SDG monitoring process for the VNRs. And as we've heard some countries discuss the importance of this, not only just for the VNR, but also for national monitoring. And then also creating ownership for that data collection and reporting by the National Statistical Office as a coordinator in that national statistical system, and using technologies to improve data collection, partner and with other stakeholders, as well as the identification of non-traditional data sources to help fill in data gaps and consider data innovations, the use of new data sources and techniques, including nowcasting and forecasting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Heather, for the presentation. And to save time, if you have a question for Heather, we can leave it after the other two presenters. So we'd like to invite some country to share their experience in preparing the VNRs and on how to address the COVID-19 impacts. The first country experience is from Spain. So we'd like to invite a joint presentation by Ms. Mercedes Gallego from Ministry of Social Rights and 2030 Agenda, and Ms. Ana Carmen Sora from National Institute of Statistics of Spain. Over to you, ladies.
Thank you, Yonggi, and thank you, Heather, for your presentations and for this opportunity. As you have said, this presentation is a joint one with the Statistical Institution. I started with the first part. Please have yes, next slide. In this scheme, you can see the 4 points. The two first ones are I'm going to talk about these ones, and the second part is Ana Carmen Saura, my colleague, who will in charge to talk about the statistical part. So please, next slide. Well, in the first place, our starting point of our vision, we want to express our strong commitment with this sentence. We want to go from words to acts, from statements to policies. This is a principle of our domestic and abroad action, and as well as a principle of coherence of policies. Another point that we want to remark is the different approach to face a crisis. In 2008, austerity was the main characteristic. But in this case, in 2020, we want to point out that the main goal is not leaving anyone behind. Another question: the 2030 agenda is a clear roadmap for us to face the social and economic reconstruction, taking into account climate change and inequality challenges. Spain has dedicated a specific chapter in the 2020 Progress Report to point out the impact of COVID in many SDGs. What I want to say is that in last report we had dedicated a chapter, so we have the compromise, the commitment to continue with this perspective, taking or briefing the impact of COVID in reconstruction. Spanish Sustainable Development Strategy, which is still in process, is the natural pathway to better implement 2030 agenda in a social and green rebuilding. During COVID pandemic, all levels of government could find a common place to talk and take decisions. This is very important for us. The coordination among all the institutions, national, regional, and local level. A wide place for dialogue and debate was open. Public and private actors, social and economical actors. So next slide, please. Thank you. Well, the big part of my intervention is regarding to policies and measures facing COVID. And well, in the first place, there are many sectors that have reflected the impact of COVID. One of them is the increase in unemployment. As regards as SDG 1, 8, 5, and 10, temporary workers and non-permanent or seasonal permanent contracts are the most vulnerable have been the most vulnerable in this crisis. We have addressed some relevant measures. Many of them is impossible to include in this slide, but well, a brief list of them: to promote conciliation, interdiction of layouts based on COVID reasons, reinforced protection to temporary workers and permanent seasonal workers, benefits and allowances for self-employees. Around 1.4 million beneficiaries is around July 2020 is when my colleague would be more precise on data, but it's the data that we are at the moment. And the ERTE, we call ERTE, is a mechanism that allows companies to issue temporary redundancy to their staff as a result of crises like COVID. This is the main measure taken against COVID and the effects of COVID unemployment. The company still pays Social Security contributions, but not the salary. When the period of ERTE is over, the worker can start to work in the same conditions. These measures has faced a layoff 3 million workers, more or less. Next slide, please. Another big sector of measures and policies has to do with something that we call the social shield. In this big measure, we trying to face or measures of small or big measures against the effects SDG 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 11, 16, and 17. There's a list with 4, but there are many more. But I started with the minimum vital income. We are very proud of this measure. This measure was approved by the government in May and supported by the majority of the Congress and the Parliament in June 2020. A benefit, it consists of a benefit to prevent the risk of poverty and social exclusion, people living alone or as a part of cohabitation unit that lacks basic economic resources. At the time of August 2020, the data were that 80,000 households had the right or acquired the right to get this benefit. Another kind of measures has to do with housing, for example, moratorium or payment of mortgage and stoppage of evictions without another housing alternative. The third one, energetic social bonus. It was not allowed to cut electricity, water and gas supplies or telecommunications for people in the worst conditions. And the last one, food aids for child nutrition in case of vulnerability. Next slide, please. Another big sector or big group of measures has to do, of course, with public health. Public health was in danger in many countries. We thought that mainly SDGs 3 and 17 have has to do with 2 SDGs. The health system was seriously damaged, mainly with the staff, and some of the measures that we have taken has to do with staff, new contracts, flexibility, incorporation, people for the system. And one point that must be pointed out is the coordination between national and regional governments in order to establish and define all these measures. Briefly, the additional investment was for staff, get medical and sanitary material, reinforce medical staff with flexibility criteria of new contracts, including workers on retirement, etc. Support with new resources for researching projects, because researching is one of the most damaged and one of the gaps, the big gaps that we've discovered with this crisis. Another measure, adopting telematic medicine mechanisms and regulating maximum price for mask, and so on. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Well, education. No, the previous one. Yes, thank you. Education is one of the big sectors with SDGs 4 and 10 that were affected. All levels of education, primary, secondary, university, etc. The shortage of personnel, computers, access to internet, an appropriate place to study or work, etc. in the families are challenges that needed suitable policies. And I want to end this big list with the National Contingency Plan Against Gender Violence related to SDG 5. Spanish government has launched an urgent service for WhatsApp messages for those women who suffered gender violence. This WhatsApp service was operative 24, 7 days a week, 24 hours, including geolocation with police and security forces. The answer against COVID has a gender perspective for us. And last one, please. Last slide. Yeah. And to end my part of intervention, we want to make to remember for all this the supporting and the contributions to multilateralism and international solidarity against COVID. Three of these three examples are in the slide. Spain has joined the International Alliance for Accelerating Access to COVID-19 Tools, ACT Accelerator. We have found multilateralist projects and alliances with, for example, two main contributions, 75 million euros for the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation in the COVID vaccine, and 50 million euros for International Alliance for Vaccination of Gavi. And the last one, promoting joint response strategy of Spanish cooperation to COVID crisis. This is a strategic document for us in the cooperation for development and with big coordination among many stakeholders. And I give the floor to my colleague.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity of presenting our work. Good morning, afternoon, everybody. I'm Ana Carmen Saura, and I work in the National Statistics Institute of Spain. In response to the lockdown of last March and the crisis caused by coronavirus, some modifications were implemented in Spain very fast. Let me share with you the most relevant ones, but there are other measures that we had to adopt. For instance, face-to-face interviews were replaced by telephone interview or web channel to collect survey data. For instance, labor force survey was changed to this process. Instead of interview people in their houses, they were changed by telephone interviews. We also incorporate new data sources to complement data collected by surveys. For instance, we had the opportunity to incorporate advanced fiscal and administrative register, and we have reached an agreement with some external stakeholders and get information from credit card transactions, which are really useful to estimate the household consumption. Another effort we carried out was on the field of communication. We tried to improve communication, including a new section in the press releases to explain in detail the impact of the pandemic in the different statistics, for instance, in the labor force survey, in the GDP, or in the consumer price index. In addition, we launched a new section on the INES website with statistical information that could be used for analysis the impact of COVID crisis. Another point I would like to underline is that the pre-announced calendar of statistics has been fully observed. In spite of COVID-19, no statistic of the National Statistical Institute has been delayed. And at European level, the European statistical system agree on common guidelines for several statistics, the labor force survey, the living condition, to reflect the impact of COVID in a harmonized and comparable way. The purpose is to have comparable indicator at international level that could be useful for making decisions at EU and national level. Next slide, please. As a consequence of the pandemic, we have observed that users, both government, administration, citizens in general, have demanded more information and timelier. So we have had to respond to these demands, and we have taken some measures. For instance, the result of the statistics on causes of death that distinguishes between COVID confirmed and suspected causes has been anticipated 12 months. This information was expected to be released in December 2021, but it has been released last December in order to meet one of the concern and one of the most demanded information of the society, that was to know how many people has died as a consequence of COVID. And we have also been requested to collaborate in other projects. The first one is an statistics to know the mobility of people, mobility of population, taking data from mobile operator. Knowing the position data of the mobile, we can know the movement of people. And this information is important, or was important, during the lockdown, to know which people have to move to work to different places. And the second project in which INE has collaborated is the methodological design of a survey on the seroprevalence study that the Ministry of Health has commissioned, with the objective to estimate which is the prevalence of COVID infection in Spain. The idea was to know how many people has suffered the COVID, or even if they were ill in that moment or had been ill before. And for monitoring the SDG progress and the impact of COVID in them, we have in Spain, SDG indicators are obtained from structural statistics, and the result of the statistics referred to 2020 are not yet available. But we have other short-term statistics that could be used to evaluate, at least partially, the impact of COVID-19 on SDGs. For instance, indicator 811, annual growth rate of GDP per capita, can be monitored by quarterly national accounts. And we can observe in the graphic that there has been a huge, an important decrease of GDP on the first quarter, and especially on the second quarter of 2020. And next slide, please. Something similar happens with indicator 892, unemployment rate. And with information from the labor force survey and the quarterly data, we can see how the unemployed people and unemployment rate has increased a lot during the second and third quarter of the year 2020 in Spain. And we can also see, thank you. And we can also see how the labor costs have been augmented. And also the employment regulation, which my colleague Mercedes told before, the number of employment regulation has been increased a lot during the second and third quarter of the last year. And next slide, please. Just to finish, there are other short-term indicators which are not specific SDGs indicator, but that can give us information on the SDG 9, SDG 1, and SDG 10. And you can see here how the COVID has had an important impact on different indicators. And as I told you before, we don't have yet the result of a structural indicator, but we expect to have them in the next month, and they will give us much more information on COVID, and they could be included in the VNR 2021. Thank you for your information, for your attention. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Mercedes and Anna, for your good presentation and share your experience on the how to report the impact of COVID-19 and your response to the challenge in terms of data collection. I would like to invite the next speaker from Myanmar, Mr. Ning Mao. Apologize if I didn't pronounce your name correctly, from the Central Statistical Organization. So the floor is yours, Ms.
Yes,
Mao.
thank you. Thank you. I'm Dr. Ning Mao from the Central Statistical Organization of Myanmar. Today, I would like to present the topic I'm going to talk about is essentially including the impact of COVID-19 in Myanmar. I'm focused on this SDG monitoring and preparation of the VNR. There are 5 outlines: Myanmar's status, and the COVID-19 economic relief plan, COVID-19 survey plan of the CSO, preparation of VNR in Myanmar, and then the challenges. Next slide, please. CSO is the national coordinator for in order to produce for SDG. So that there are 2 reports are released. The first one is the SDG data assessment report in May 2016, and then the SDG indicator based reports in August 2017, coordinated with the UNDP. Next slide, please. SDG data assessment reports makes more clear the national data to calculate the SDG indicator. There are several findings. For example, a readily available indicators is 50.3%, and the latent effort is 37.1%, and something like that. You can see clearly the SDG data assessment report in next slide in the pie chart. Next slide, please. Yes, this pie chart is more clear to the summarize of the finding of the SDG data assessments in Myanmar. Next slide, please. Yes, I have mentioned above SDG indicator based reports was released in August 2017. There are 196 indicators presented in this base reports out of the 320 separate out indicators. So 61% of the SDG indicators are available for Myanmar. And the goal 8, this is the highest available indicator, it's about 85%. This report is a summary of the indicator availability of Myanmar. The chapter compares the data for Myanmar availability for Myanmar with the regional, Southeastern Asian and world aggregates. Next slide, please. Now I would like to introduce COVID-19 economic relief plan in Myanmar. COVID-19 pandemic is Myanmar has also suffered like other countries over the world, and now over 132,000 people are affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and then Myanmar government is suffered to notice not subject to the high density populated area, and we have 100,000 people are returning from the abroad, so that we have notice for these persons not to subject for the densely populated due to the COVID-19 pandemic, so that we need to do the analysis for the vulnerable groups for sharaks, elderly, women, internal displaced persons, and then rural and urban poor states region of Myanmar. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to introduce the COVID-19 economic relief plan, CERP. It was released in April 27, 2020 from the Ministry of Planning, Finance and Industry. It measure to mitigate the range of the Myanmar COVID-19 pandemic effect in Myanmar economy. It consists of 7 goals, 10 strategies, and 36 action plans. It was also aligned with the not only Myanmar Sustainable Development Plan, but also Global SDG. Next slide, please. CRB Goal 1 and Goal 3 are also aligned with the Global SDG Goal 8. And under these goals, we have 1 strategies and 1 action plans. Next slide, please. In order to fulfill this Goal 1 and Goal 3, the government arranged, for example, lowering bank deposit and the lending rates by the 3%, and then lowering minimum research requirements by the banks, something like that. And then labor intensive community infrastructure projects are also laid down and for the workers and workers returning the migrants. Next slide, please. CRB Goal 6 is fully aligned with the Goal 3 of the SDG. All of you know that healthcare system is very important for every country. In Myanmar governments arranged for the quarantine facilities and then imported the key projects from other countries for the related to the COVID-19 and improve the preventive healthcare system. And then we have a long-term plan for improving the capacity of the healthcare centers and health facilities. Next slide, please. And Ministry of Education is now timing to reopen the primary school, middle school, high school, and university in order to improve the quality of education. That's fully aligned with the Global SDG Goal 4. So that when we reopen the primary school, middle school, and high school, and university, all of the students and teachers must obey the guideline from the Ministry of Health and Sport. Next slide, please. So CSO Myanmar have a plan to monitor high frequency monitoring survey of COVID-19 impact on household welfare and family activities. This was focused on the household socio-economic impacts of COVID-19, on households in rural urban areas. Then next plan is socio-economic assessments of the COVID-19 impact of the COVID-19 in Myanmar. This was focused on the vulnerable groups and entrepreneurs and digital transformation. Next slide, please. Assessment of the impact of the COVID-19 in key vulnerable groups will focus on the identification and monitoring of the major socio-economic impacts on vulnerable populated groups, which laboratory assets and saving assets to insurance and assure public health services. Assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on entrepreneurs and digital transformation will focus on entrepreneurs, particularly in young, women-owned, led business as a micro small scale. These survey data are described on the COVID-19 high frequency dashboards coordination with the CSO and UNDP. Next slide, please. Therefore, CSOs intend to the household vulnerability survey, HLPF survey is conducted, and the data from the 2,000 households from all states and regions, including the NAPIDO. Then, cybersecurity organization and UNDP are working together with aligned ministries in order to produce a timeline for the official statistics during the COVID-19 pandemic. We are creating the Myanmar COVID-19 statistical data dashboard, MMSDD, in which there are 2 groups. The first one group is socio-economic indicators and the regular release of the CSO. Then the second groups include indicators of with respect to the COVID-19 according to the CRP plan. And then MMHTD, Myanmar COVID-19 high frequency dashboard is also for the first page of this MMSTD. You can see very soon this dashboard. Next slide, please. Moreover, CSO is coordinated with the World Bank in order to do for the high frequency phone survey. It was focused on the socio-economic impact on COVID-19 and also in urban and rural areas. You can see the data on the Myanmar COVID-19 monitoring platform on the government websites. The following links, you can see that this data. Next slide, please. I would like to introduce preparation of the Vienna in Myanmar. Firstly, I would like to introduce the Myanmar Sustainable Development Plan. This was released in 2018 from Ministry of Planning, Finance and Industry. This was fully aligned with the global SDGs and the 12 point of the Myanmar economic policy and the regional commitment. So that in order to monitor the evaluation of this implementation of the MSTB, CSO is identified with the national indicator framework. We have a draft report of the NIF document and NIF data reports that's already they are released very soon. We have a plan to update for these reports every year. These reports will be soon in 2021. And then we have a plan for SDG-based reports in every 5 years, so that we have a plan to release, to upgrade and release in 2021 also. Next slide, please. I would like to continue the present preparation of the Vienna in Myanmar. Currently, Myanmar is starting to prepare the Vienna, jointly coordinated with the planning department as a secretary and statistical organization as a co-secretary. The working group and co-group are now formulated in order to submit Vienna in time. Planning department is sub as a secretary, and our CSO and other related organizations and ministries heavy collaboration and supporting as a partner by partnering as a member of the working group and co-group respectively. Next slide, please. So we had these challenges as other countries over the world. The first challenge is for the SDG monitoring and to prepare for the Vienna. Firstly, the data shortage for the monitoring of the SDG and available of the high data quality, reliable data, and the timeliness and the disaggregate data. During the COVID-19 pandemic, which problem is the weakness of the cooperation between the government and public in working level, operational level, technical level, and the community communication level in order to get the data for SDG monitoring. And then, already you know that capacity for statistical units and other related ministries needs to be strengthened. So the line ministries or other departments take initiatives in administrative data, generation of administrative data related to the SDG. Now Myanmar CSO is creating open SDG data platform with the help of the UNSD and other UNSD FCDO project. We have it targeted to launch in May 2021. Next slide, please. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mao, for your presentation, and it's very excellent. You, in particular, you share your country's response and how to conduct a survey during this COVID, and on how to assess the impact of COVID, and together with your experience on how to prepare SDG monitoring and the Vienna report. So given the time, we probably will have a little bit of short discussion time. for this session. And firstly, I would like to ask any participant have a question for the three speakers previously. Maybe before I open the floor, I will have one question from previous session from Indonesia to Egypt and Japan. How have your country conducted the survey during the pandemic to ensure that data of SDG indicators can be reported on VNR 2021? So we'll probably, if Egypt and Japan can share a little bit your experience in addition to the two-country experience from Spain and Myanmar. Maybe I will give the floor to the colleague from Egypt first.
Hello, thank you. So to answer this question very quickly, some surveys were done through phone calls instead of field visits, and such as, for example, the household income expenditures and consumption survey. And also there was another survey about the impact of COVID-19 on small and medium enterprises. So some of the surveys were conducted through phone calls, and but other data for SDG indicators, I mean, not all of them required surveys. So other data were collected from the ministries through, emails and so on. And there was no need for field visits for all of the SDG indicators, just some of them, and they were done through phone calls. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. May I invite Ms. Aya Yoshida, if you can quickly reply to the question.
On behalf of Japan, since Ms. Yoshida has already left. So I'm Morita from Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So almost same as Egypt, we also conducted surveys through emails or phone calls. Not all the surveys need field visits. So that's why we could conduct and collect data, though we face a COVID-19 crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much for answer the questions. And so we will see if anyone have some questions for the speakers or other questions related to the impacts of COVID or how to conduct data collection during the COVID pandemic. You're welcome. But we can also leave some of the questions for the session 3, which is also very relevant to use alternative data source and data innovation to report on SDGs, and particularly in the pandemic period. Okay, let me see. Okay, I don't see any questions hand raised. And given the time, maybe we can move on to session 3. And if you have a question, you can also ask in the chat, and we try to address at the end of the session. So I will hand it over back to Heather to facilitate this session.
Thank you, Young-Yi. So this is we're going to start session 3 on integrating new data sources and data innovations for official statistics, as well as partnerships with stakeholders. And as we have heard from many countries, they're actively engaged in integrating new data sources and data innovation into official statistics to help fully describe the progress of SDG implementation at the national level. So this session will focus on some best practices and experiences in integrating these new data sources and innovations for official statistics, as well as SDG monitoring during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as partnerships with stakeholders which can support evidence-based VNRs. Our first presenter will be Mr. Luis Morales, who is the Chief of the Web Development and Data Visualization section here at UNSD and the Statistics Division. So I will hand it over to him now. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather and colleagues. So I I see that you have put the presentation on screen. That's great. So let me just start with a brief introduction for this session, and we will be followed by speakers from country experiences, Denmark and Colombia. So from my side, I want to provide an overview of the work on integrating new data sources and respond to some of the questions posed in the annotated agenda. So can you go to the next slide? So the questions are there any new data sources or data innovations used in SDG monitoring, particularly in light of the COVID-19 situations? What could be the advantages of using such new data sources and innovations to report on the SDG indicators? And how to harness those new data and statistics produced by non-official sources from different stakeholders, so while ensuring data quality. So while I think I will touch on all of these three questions, mostly my presentation will be focusing on the last one. Next slide, please. So in the context we are right now, the worldwide spread of the pandemic calls for new kind of leadership by national statistical organizations in particular, and the national statistical systems at large. The SDG monitoring systems cannot default to known approaches, and we're in a situation where we are called to find what we could call the next practices rather than the best practices in a situation of a continuous change and new challenges. So the initial responses by the national statistical offices need to be followed by sustained focus on innovation over time, and changes and adaptations not only in the production of statistics, but along the whole data value chain, from collection to dissemination and use. And for instance, there has to be a clear link between the outputs of these new data sources, new technologies, and the VNR process to ensure that the demands of policymakers and all stakeholders are met. Next slide, please. So this crisis has also been a catalyst for collaboration and innovation, as there is need to build integrated statistical systems that require a lot of collaboration across providers and users of data, and within and across individual organizations. And this COVID crisis is spurring an unprecedented level of innovation, particularly in situations where there's resources and funding that traditionally were not available to pursue risky or innovation projects are now more. It's easier to make the case to invest in those innovations. Next slide, please. But this innovation requires, as I was saying, a collaborative, multidisciplinary approach to address methodological and institutional challenges, to be able to process and analyze inputs coming from different sources, to share best practices, and to promote experimentation and co-creation of information products. And this collaboration is key to be able to draw from different data assets, different skills, and different resources that are available across national statistical systems and also across the global statistical system. Next slide, please. To the question on how can these innovations be harnessed, I want to refer to a few principles that could provide some of the answer and maybe some discussion around what can we do in order to be able to really leverage those innovations in a sustainable manner. These principles are derived from the common statistical production architecture. And so if you are familiar with that, the CISPA tools, this will be nothing new to you, but I think this is relevant to the discussion in this session. So some of the principles that I would like to underline as important in order to make those innovations in data sources and in alternative approaches are here. So starting with a holistic approach, meaning that the data methods and technologies need to be consistent with what we have already, need to be reusable and interoperable. The focus should be in the end result, in the envisioned output. So starting from what is the need at hand that needs to be met. And this is related to also focusing on the value to the user. So the services and the products that are now being developed need to deliver value to the users, to the end users. So it's not innovation an end in itself, but the user to the values. And the sustainability is also something I've been referring to ensure that these innovations can be sustained over the long term, that can be adapted and further developed by the statistical systems that implement them. Some principles that are also good approaches when deciding where to invest in terms of that innovation, or what innovation avenues to pursue, is to reuse all existing capabilities before designing new ones. And if there are no available capabilities, to design new ones with the objective of being able to reuse them and maximizing the use of what already exists. Next slide, please. And another set of principles to conclude with this list is make sure that the outputs are discoverable and accessible, and that they are at the right appropriate level of disaggregation. So meaning that the level of disaggregation needed by the data users, by decision makers, also ensuring trust and security, and ensuring that we work in partnership, both at the national and international level, so that we can collaborate and leverage knowledge and skills and resources and make efficient use of them. So next slide, please. So among those principles, some things that can be also underlined is the importance of national ownership of data innovation for the SDG monitoring. So these projects that help implement and monitor the 2030 agenda cannot survive without country ownership and funding. So decision makers in governments, senior officials across the national statistical system, in particular the national statistical offices, need to be convinced that the projects, data innovation projects, do fit with the national strategy for the development statistics and other policy agendas. And this national ownership also requires that the local staff should be able to operate them and to make the right choices regarding sources, technology, and methods that meet their own needs and their own context and different national contexts. Next slide, please. Partnerships are important for being able to bring in the broad technical expertise that is required in the complex data production processes of today. So people that have no one single individual has all the expertise required, so it's needed to bring in all the skills, the practical experiences in order to implement data innovations in the field. And it's in particular important to from the beginning to engage local experts so that the interest in the outcomes and the sustainability of the outcomes also is warranted. Next slide, please. this collaboration with the experts in production is mirrored also with the need for engaging with the users of the outputs of those innovation projects. It's important to build strong ties of collaboration between the technical experts developing the solutions and the user community. And stakeholders from key user groups need to be part of all these efforts. Next slide, please. And one important aspect as well is the need to establish trust. The reliability of the sources and methods involved in data innovation projects for sustainable development is central to their acceptance and their use and their impact. So this in particular requires transparent and participatory validation from stakeholders that will provide the necessary inputs to make sure that the quality, the methodologies are sound, and that the production processes are reproducible and are yielding quality results. Next slide, please. And of course, related to trust in the result is also trust in the organizations producing those results. So the innovation projects need to have data privacy and security protocols in place so that there is no risk of damaging the reputation of and the trust that both providers of data and users of data put into the national statistical offices. So these projects are trusted and can be sustained over the long term. So next slide, please. And another aspect I wanted to also bring up is the importance of small initiatives, bottom-up data innovation initiatives, which can play a very important role in statistical organizations' response to disruptions, such as the disruptions of the COVID-19 situation. In these times of crisis, listening to what different communities have to contribute and pooling the knowledge, the collective knowledge and skills of multiple stakeholders is very important. Next slide. And I want to finish with two examples of things that have been going on over the last year that are exemplify efforts of the global statistical community to collaborate and to innovate. First is the global COVID-19 survey of national statistical offices. That is a joint initiative between the UN and the World Bank to obtain a clear picture about the response of national statistical offices to the challenges of the COVID-19 crisis in terms of challenges to the statistical production and new demands for statistics, and also identify the gaps and so that the international community can step up and provide support wherever it is needed. Next slide, please. Out of this, we identify a few priorities in terms of mobilizing resources to support SDG monitoring activities affected by the pandemic and to launch new statistical activities to satisfy emerging data demands. Also, the need to obtain access to authoritative, reliable sources of data to monitor day-to-day evolution of the health crisis, to monitor the social, economic, environmental impact, and to inform recovery policies over the long term. Third, to obtain access to methodological guidance of how to use these new data sources, these new methods and technologies for the collection, processing, and analysis of the data, and how to communicate and disseminate it to their users or their intended users. And finally, they need to coordinate the initiatives that are being that are taking place at the local, national, and global levels. And next slide. This is also my final slide. I wanted to mention the Data for Now initiative that supports countries in the use of innovative sources, technologies, and methods for the production of better, more timely, and disaggregated data for sustainable development. This is a joint initiative between the Statistics Division, the World Bank, the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, launched a little bit more than 1 year ago, and by the Deputy Secretary General, and which is supporting at the moment eight countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and we are looking to expand also the participation to a larger number of countries. One of the countries that we are working with is Colombia, and I'm happy to also have the opportunity to hear from them what is their perspective in terms of data innovation for the SDGs in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you. Next slide, and I conclude here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis. We really appreciate it. So without any delay, I think we'll go into the country experiences. And our first presenter is Mr. Niels Plo. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, from Statistics Denmark, to provide us with information on integrating new data sources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather, and thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be able to, in 10 minutes, to try to give you a presentation on 4 different issues. The one is the production system based on admin data that we have in Statistics Denmark, and then we use basically for our production and also for the production of the global SDG indicators. In some way, it's I know that for many, this way of producing statistics would be new. For us, it's kind of ironic to call it new. We've done it for 30 years, more or less. And what I will do is that I will say something about the advantages that we experience in using these kind of data. Then I will move on to say something about the our work with the SDGs, including the partnership that we have created in relation to that. And finally, I will just briefly say a little bit about an additional SDG indicator project, a national project that we have been conducting within the last year or something like that. So if you move on to the next slide, yes, please. Now, since the beginning of the 1980s, we have in Denmark done basically most of our social statistics based on data from admin sources. And there's a number of examples mentioned here. One of the advantages of that is that it's data that are covering, and maybe you should just go to the next slide. It's data that are covering the whole population, or the population in focus, which could be the people on unemployment or people in education or whatever. And as it's been showed during the COVID-19 situation, we did also get the data that we used to get. So there was no delay in data production. The public sector in Denmark, the state, the regions, and the municipalities were all working from home, though. But we did get the data, and we were able to increase our publications with the weekly publication of death rates, actually on a daily basis, but we did publish them the weekly, and other kinds of innovations that are based on the data sources that we have. So we have the right to get those data, and we use them for the production of statistics. On top of covering the whole population, it's also actually a very economically efficient way of doing statistics. And the example of what we do when we do the census, and we do a census in Denmark just like everybody else do, is that we basically have 2 extra people working on the census in order to manage the population register so that it fits into the requirements in relation to the census. And we can do a census on a daily basis. So if you want to know how many people live in Denmark on the 18th of January 2021, ask me in 1 or 2 days, and I'll be able to give you the answer to that. So as it said, it has a wide coverage and continuity. So yeah, it's a very efficient system. Next slide, please. The next slide shows kind of basically, and if you just push one more time, then yeah, exactly. Thank you. The next slide shows the core of this system that we have. So what you need to have if you want to have a system like that is kind of similar to ours, you need to have a register with a unique identification of each person in society. You need to have a register with the identification of each building in the country, and you need to have a register of the unique identification of each enterprise in the country too. And if you have that, you can combine them, and you can combine them through the unique identifier of persons that we have, and which was introduced in Denmark in the late 1960s, with every kind of information that comes from the tax register, including income, health, and education, employment, whatever. So this is basically a very kind of cost-effective and efficient system. So if you take the next slide, the next slide shows the front page of our SDG website at Statistics Denmark. And you can find that if you just go to the English version of our website and punch SDGs in the search field, you will get to that. And if you punch one of the 17 goals, you will come to the targets and the data that are supporting that. And most of those data are data that are based on the sources that I showed you before, namely the data from the admin registers. So next slide. Therefore, we have the admin data as an essential component of what we are doing. We use them as nominators and denominators, and they cover the issues mentioned in the last dot. Education, health, private sector are based on that. So with that, we entered the work of creating the website with the SDG indicators. And we did that in close collaboration with a number of stakeholders. So if you just go to the next slide, you will see a picture of people who actually participated in the partnership, taking part in the creation of the dissemination of the data that we wanted to use for the SDGs. And in doing that, we created, as we had basically already in relation to our main statistical products, the legitimacy in relation to the data that we are using. So if you take the next slide, the thing is that we created a partnership with stakeholders that included from the very beginning politicians from the national and local level, people representing NGOs, business, including business organization, labor organizations, and academia. We have gathered them 3 times a year. In the beginning, we were very focused on the web page that we were building. They were kind of our reference source and group. We showed them and shared with them our ideas of how to disseminate the SDGs and what kind of data to use. And they gave us feedback on that. They were actually also the first group that saw the kind of beta version of the web page. And therefore, we had them on board all along when we were doing it. To not be modest, it's actually a major success. And I have been wondering several times why it became a success. The success is that we have now more than 100 people on the mailing list of the partnership, and more than 70, 80 people showing up every time we ask them to come to Statistics Denmark. They are very engaged and very productive and gives a lot of very good input to what we're doing. And that is not the case in other areas of statistics. And I think the explanation to that is what I labeled in the last bullet, the NSO advantages. The thing is that in any country in the whole world, there are very few organizations who actually have to take all the SDGs, including all the indicators and the targets, seriously. But the NSO have. We have, as an NSO, to take every measure point here serious, which means that it's interesting for us to talk to everybody. A lot of the people who show up in our partnership, they're only interested in a very small fraction of the indicators. But we are interested, we are interesting to talk to, seen from their side, and for us, they're also interesting to talk to. So therefore, I think it's everybody should try to harvest on this NSO advantage, being one of the few organizations in any given country that have to take whatever is going on in the SDG area serious. Next slide, please. Now, the partnership then led to the fact that we have been engaged with members of parliament in Denmark, cross party lines. More than 60 members of parliament have created a network of SDG parliamentarians, and they are now making a visit to all the standing committees in parliament to inform them about the possibilities in using the SDG indicators. And we are, as Statistics Denmark, part of the delegation that is visiting the standing committees. We are also a member of what is called the 2030 panel, which is created by this parliamentarian network, which is representatives of people in the Danish society representing NGOs, business partners, labor unions, academia, and so on. So we have become a very trusted partner in the work with the SDGs. And my last point here is that we have, as I said in the introduction, been working on a national project creating with a process of engaging people nationwide, 197 additional national Danish indicators within the framework of the 17 goals in the SDGs, and you will also be able to find that in an English version on our webpage if you have taken interest in that. Thank you very much. That was all I had.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate the presentation. I think everyone is starting to put questions over into the chat to you. So we'll go over some of those, but also they're directed to you as well in the chat. Thank you very much. Next, we will hear from Ms. Karen Chavez from the National Administrative Department of Statistics, DANE of Colombia. So I will give the floor to her. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Could you please confirm if you are hearing me now?
We hear you well, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Karen and I work for the National Statistics Office. I lead the work for SDGs indicators here in Colombia. Next slide, please. First, I'm going to start with this slide. Since our first partner is the High-Level Commission and data priorities comes from policy documents plus data needs expressed by national institutions. So we have this legal framework in Colombia. We have two main interinstitutional instances. So in first place, we have the High-Level SDG Commission, and we also have the Technical Committee for SDGs. The High-Level SDG Commission is composed by 3 ministries: Finance, Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development, plus 4 autonomous departments with a similar hierarchy than ministries. Besides these 2 instances, For coordinations, we have policy documents. I would like to highlight these 3 documents. We have a long-term document called Compass, and this Compass gives us the national SDGs indicators framework and also a set of global indicators prioritized at national level. I'm saying this here that this is a long-term document because it's like the roadmap of the country to the 2030. And also we have these mid or short-term policy documents. 2 national development plans has been already incorporated in their agenda, the SDGs. So we have the National Development Plan, the current National Development Plan, and also the past National Development Plan include SDGs in their priorities. Also, I want to say that this high-level SDGs Commission and also the technical committees work in partnerships with civil society, private sector, academy, and international organizations. Next slide, please. In DANI, the work with alternative sources of information start with the use of satellite imagery. Here we have, for example, of specific SDGs indicators from Go 11 that we have worked with satellite imageries. So we have the indicator 11.1.1, the proportion of urban population living in slums, informal settlement, or inadequate housing. How we are using satellite imagery, we use it to for the classification to determine informal settlements. Also, we have here indicator 11.2.1, the proportion of population that has convenient access to public transport by sex, age, and persons with disabilities. We use the satellite images to classify and determine the urban area of cities. We also have indicator 11.3.1, ratio land consumption in terms of rate of population growth rate. Here we use satellite imageries to determine land consumption of cities. And finally, we have indicator 11.7.1, the average of the built-up area of cities that is open space for public use for all by sex, age, and persons with disabilities. We use land cover classification using a remote sensing imagery collection to identify the urban area in selected cities and their green places. Next slide, please. I want to highlight that usually the satellite imagery is combined with another sources of information. So here I will give a specific example with indicator 9.1.1, who has been already calculated in Colombia. In the same way, the previous indicators has been combined with other sources of information. It's just a matter of time that I'm using this as an example here. So we use both external sources and internal sources of information. External sources of information, I am referring to sources of information that are not from DANI, and internal sources of information, it's the information that we currently have in DANI. So since this indicator, the proportion of the rural population who live within 2 kilometers of an all-season road, well, we can have from a satellite image the distance obtained as a straight line. However, it's needed to consider lakes, rivers between houses and roads. So that's why we are using the high hydrographic coverage. And also it's important to consider diverse geographical accidents, especially in a country as Colombia. That's why we use also the digital elevation model. So, I mean, here in Colombia, the soil varies across the country, so this is important for us. Also, we are using the road coverage. these three sources are coming from the Geographical Institute in Colombia called Agustin Codazzi, and also we are using the National Population and Housing Census, plus the National Geostatistical Framework to know the delimitation of urban and rural areas. In addition to the indicators I just mentioned, the Geospatial Working Group of the IAET SDGs has a full list of SDGs indicators that could be calculated with the use of geospatial information. And also I want to highlight that beyond these particular measures that we used at some point as a starting point for the use of geospatial information, now Danny is thinking in the integration of geospatial information to the statistical production process. So we are currently working in the implementation of a model as the one described in the next slide, please. Thank you. This model is an adapted version of the one proposed in the Global Statistical Geospatial Framework, and it's a working paper from the United Nations Expert Group on the Integration of Statistical and Geospatial Information. We want also to highlight that the pretended final use of the produced info are its dissemination, analysis, and the use as a key input for public policy making. That's why we have been working with the dissemination of geolocalized statistical information in different platforms. Next slide, please. As an example, we currently are working in an artist hub with Esri for SDGs. Here, we are mainly using numeric information that could be geolocated in maps. We identify the list of SDGs indicators in which it's available. Disaggregation at subnational levels allows us to produce a good map. The political administrative division in Colombia has more than 1,000 municipalities. So in cases where we have data for all municipalities, it's better having a map that shows by color the performance of municipalities than an Excel file with more than 1,000 rows. And next slide, please. Also, we have already produced some GeoViewers and are available for consulting in our webpage. And this is also a result of the data obtained from the last census that we have been able to publish data not only at municipal level, also we have published data at per block level. And we consider that this is relevant, especially in big cities, because you can clearly identify areas with better performance in statistics compared to other areas. And I also want to highlight that the last census in Colombia asked questions about disability and ethnic self-recognition. So this is like a good source of information for us. Next slide, please. So now going beyond the use of the geospatial information, either as a source of information and or to geolocate alphanumeric information that we already have. I want to highlight that Dani has, in terms of data, a representation with the UN system at different levels. Also, we recognize the work that has been done by the IEG SDGs in order to have most of the methodologies available now. At the same time, we consider that the availability of data is key for monitoring, and also that that the data be used as a key tool in the public policy design. So we also have a working group with agencies of the UN system in Colombia, and we basically work with them in data availability for SDGs in Colombia. One of the main bottlenecks in order to have SDGs available that we at least have identified here in Colombia is the availability of sources of information. So with this come the data for now strategy. So for us, this is a possibility to strengthen the national statistics system, the SDG framework, who has a lot of indicators, plus the regional indicators, plus the national indicators, and plus these aggregations could be seen as a huge responsibility for National Statistics Office, but also at the same time is an opportunity for us to innovate and to try to look for alternative methodologies and alternative sources of information. Next slide, please. I just want to mention quickly that we have developed a barometer that measure how close is an indicator to be produced in Colombia. It's not only the indicator is produced or not produced. So we have a measure that goes from 0 to 100, and we also have identified that one bottleneck is when indicators are going to go from category C to category B, and the main reason is because the sources of information are not available or data is not complete. That's a huge reason for us to look for some different sources of information. Next slide, please. This is why we have been working in the framework of the Data for Now strategy in a IT architecture as a cross-cutting line, because one of the weaknesses of statistical production here in Colombia is the use of administrative records. So we would like to conceptualize and deepen the governance structure that allows strengthening the use of administrative records to produce statistical information. Also, it's important that, as in the case of geospatial information, you are not only using one kind of source of information. So we are starting with administrative records. However, we want to see what happens in a whole ecosystem of interoperability with different sources of information. Next slide, please. And as an example, also in the framework of the Data for Now strategy, we are working in the calculation of multidimensional poverty index at municipality level. We have been able to calculate it with data from census. The problem is that we have census every 10 years, and we want to have this measure available in a shorter time period. So what we are trying to do is compile geospatial coordinates data sets and also combine that with data from surveys and try to use a generalized linear mixed model with some variation geostatistical model to estimate, to produce accurate estimates of MPI at municipality levels in 4 years where we don't have data available from census. Next slide, please. And also, I will go quickly in these last exercises. We have been working in the nighttime light as a proxy of economic activity during COVID-19 outbreak. We currently have monthly measures of production and employees and power consumptions of firms here, and we want to see how much it has changed the night lights in before, comparing before the use of night lights before the lockdown here in Colombia and during a period of lockdown here, and compare these results with the production and employees results that we have for firms. Next slide, please. Also, we are already working in an early estimation of manufacturing production. The reason is basically because the lack of the annual estimate for industry production is of 45 days, and we want to have the early annual estimation with a lag of just 15 days. Next slide, please. And finally, we are also using a microdata classification algorithm, and we are trying to integrate the Social Security Register and household survey. So we want just to combine these two data sets, modeling and machine learning algorithm and a classification model. And so we want to estimate like how the informality has been changing during COVID period. Next slide, please. And finally, I want to mention that how we see this or the use of these innovative methods and sources of information in terms of quality. And so we have in done this line called experimental statistics. For us, what Danny understands as experimental statistic currently is the one that is derived from projects in development that have at least one of the following innovative aspects: new sources of information, the statistical methodology, or a new topic not previously measured. All statistics produced by Danny in Colombia are official. However, we want to differentiate these experimental statistics that are starting now from the regular statistics. So that's why we have starting to work in this line. Also, we have decided that in order to have an experimental statistic in this status as an official statistic, out of the 10 quality attributes of statistics coming from the quality assurance framework, we consider that at least experimental statistics should have relevance, opportunity, accessibility, interpretability, coherence, and transparency. We want to innovate. However, we also need to guarantee that innovation has a purpose. And also because we consider that we not only have a technical responsibility, but also a social responsibility in producing statistics that are a key tool for public policy design. And with this, I think I conclude. Many thanks. Back to you, Heather.
Thank you so much, Karen. This is very useful for participants. I apologize to everyone that we are running a little bit behind. We'll just take these two questions that are in the chat. The first one is directed to Denmark. How do you manage the leaving no one behind perspective in terms of variables that are not included in registers? Disability, self-reported health, etc. Thank you.
Well, actually, disability is included in the registers. We do have microdata on everybody in Denmark who get any kind of benefit, either in cash or kind, based on the fact that they have a disability. And we do have the National Association of People with Disabilities as part of our partnership. So we have a very fruitful dialogue with them on how to use the register-based data to create variables. I'm sorry about the dog. It's looking at itself in the mirror. To create data that can support the issue on people with disabilities. Self-reported health is an issue. It's a challenge. We have a national survey, but it comes only every third year. So therefore we have a challenge there. But I think we are moving in the direction of trying to solve the challenge in relation to people with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you. There was an additional question in the chat for this discussion period how does the UNSC see the result of SDGs indexed by SDSN on the VNR process, since their index is referred by many actors, especially non-state actors, to monitor the achievement of the countries on SDGs? So this I will direct either to Luis or Yongyi.
Yeah, I will try to address this question because we have been asked by many country representatives and other people from the NSO on this question. Firstly, I would like to clarify that the Global Indicator Framework developed by the IGSDG is the authoritative list of indicators for the global monitoring SDGs. So other indicators that developed by national can be used to provide further monitoring at the national, regional, and thematic level. In this regard, the SDG index and dashboard developed by the SDSN contain useful complementary information and analysis. Might be additional tool in the process of implementation agenda, but they're not the official monitoring of the SDGs. Just try to clarify because people confuse. They think this is official UN ranking of the country, and we also want to bring caution when you use the composite index, and also how to interpret the index. Composite index is a combination of a high number of variables. Particular for the SDSN index, I think their methodology changes year to year. There's no comparison between the ranking from previous year, because we were asked in the past by some country why the ranking dropped by 10 from like 2018 to 2019, and was there any reason? And we just also want to clarify. And in that sense, in this indicators, there are no comparison because of the indicator included in the index change, and the methodology also probably varies a little bit. Indexes also carries a measurement under the technical difficulty of all individual indicators. And they're useful as advocacy tools, and because they enable rankings and attract attention. However, I just want to caution when trying to analyze a particular shortcomings or operationalize the intervention in a particular field. It's difficult to pinpoint opportunity areas by using the index. Moreover, ranking sometimes incentive countries to promote short-term policy, which like a long-term soundness to improve the country's position in the ranking. So this is just some caution I want to bring to the using of the index. So thank you. Maybe I'll use this opportunity because we're over by 15 minutes to close today's workshop. I will not going to summarize today's discussion. Maybe we'll give a recap early tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. So I would like to take the opportunity to thank all of the participants for attending this workshop, and also all the presenters to give the excellent presentations, to share the experience and a good practice in implementing and monitoring the SDGs. So thank you very much. We will see you tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock New York time. And we'll hope you have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.